During a brutal winter survival course in the freezing Sierra Nevada mountains, I slipped on an icy slope and thought my life was over. A decorated Marine major refused to leave my side and carried me through the howling wind to safety. Breathless and shivering against his chest, I looked up at him and said, "Whoever marries you will be a lucky woman." He leaned close, his voice cutting through the storm, and whispered that he hoped it would be me. "My name is Haley, and I am 33 years old. I spend my days surviving the harshest wilderness environments on Earth. But surviving my own family has always been the ultimate test of endurance. Tonight, at an ultra-exclusive country club in Denver, my parents rented the main dining room to celebrate my younger sister. As she raised her glass to mock my life choices, calling me nothing more than a glorified camp counselor, I simply smiled and touched the heavy corporate card hidden in my pocket. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to sit quietly while toxic family members drastically underestimated your worth. Growing up in a sprawling modern estate in the wealthy suburbs of Denver meant that appearances were everything to my parents. Inside our immaculate home, emotional warmth was entirely replaced by the relentless pursuit of status. My father Richard and my mother Susan measured human value purely by corporate titles and bank account balances. My sister Courtney, who is now 30 years old, absorbed this superficial value system perfectly. From the time we were children, she was groomed to be their golden child. She wore the right designer clothes, befriended the right wealthy people, and pursued the right prestigious business degree. I was the exact opposite. I preferred hiking boots to high heels and the quiet solitude of the mountains to the superficial chatter of country club galas. My parents never tried to hide their profound disappointment in me. Whenever I returned home covered in dirt with scraped knees from rock climbing, my mother would sigh dramatically and ask why I could not be more like my polished, pristine sister. The message was ingrained in me from a young age that my passions were merely foolish hobbies, while Courtney was destined for absolute greatness. Tonight was the ultimate manifestation of their blatant favoritism. The country club was dripping with ostentatious luxury. Crystal chandeliers cast a warm golden glow over tables covered in crisp white linen. Waiters in tailored uniforms floated silently around the room, refilling crystal flutes with vintage champagne. My parents had spared absolutely no expense. They had rented the grandest dining room on a Saturday night to host a lavish launch party for Courtney and her brand new business venture. She had recently registered a company called Summit Defense, and according to her, she was on the verge of securing a massive government contract. I sat at the far end of the long head table, feeling completely out of place in my dark tailored jeans and a simple olive green button-down shirt. My practical leather boots were hidden beneath the tablecloth, but I could still feel the disapproving glares from my mother every time she looked in my direction. Susan wore a heavy pearl necklace and a tight designer dress that mirrored her rigid personality. Richard sat at the head of the table wearing a custom-tailored suit projecting the image of a proud patriarch, and right beside him sat Courtney soaking up the adoration of our extended family like a sponge. Before the main courses arrived, the waiters had circulated with silver platters of expensive caviar and Wagyu beef tartare. Courtney had snapped her fingers at a young waiter, demanding he bring her a fresh glass of champagne because hers was not sufficiently chilled. She treated the service staff with the same casual disdain she reserved for me. My parents watched her rude behavior and simply smiled, viewing her entitlement as a sign of strong executive leadership. It was nauseating to witness, but I forced myself to maintain a neutral expression. I watched my uncle attempt to ask Courtney a specific question about wilderness navigation, trying to show polite interest in her new venture. Courtney completely deflected the question, tossing her perfectly styled blonde hair and steering the conversation back to the profit margins and the stock options she planned to issue once the company went public. She did not know the first thing about navigation, but she knew how to spin a web of corporate jargon that sounded impressive to people who did not know any better. Courtney tapped her manicured fingernail against her champagne glass to demand the attention of the 30 guests gathered around the table, Everyone fell silent immediately, trained by years of my parents' conditioning to treat Courtney as the absolute center of the universe. Thank you all for being here to witness the beginning of my empire, she announced, her voice echoing off the high ceilings. As you know, I recently launched Summit Defense. I realize there is a massive gap in the market for elite wilderness training and tactical survival consulting. The Department of Defense is currently accepting bids for a multi-million-dollar contract to train their special operations units. I have submitted my proposal, and let us just say the competition does not stand a chance. I know exactly how to play the corporate game, and the military needs a sharp business mind to modernize their outdated protocols. I took a slow sip of my sparkling water to hide the amused smile tugging at the corners of my mouth. Courtney had never pitched a tent in her life. She complained about the lack of cellular service if we drove more than 20 miles outside the city limits. Her idea of wilderness survival was staying at a luxury ski lodge when the room service menu was limited. Yet here she was boasting to our aunts, uncles, and cousins about revolutionizing military survival training. I knew the exact Department of Defense contract she was talking about. I knew every intricate detail of the rigorous bidding process, the intense physical requirements, and the strict federal regulations. But I kept my mouth tightly shut. Letting her inflate her ego with empty buzzwords was much easier than trying to inject reality into a room full of people who only wanted to hear a fairy tale. My father raised his glass, his chest puffed out with arrogant pride. To Courtney, he boomed, his voice filled with the genuine affection he rarely ever directed at me. A true visionary who understands the value of building a real family legacy. She took her expensive business degree and turned it into an absolute goldmine. This is what true ambition looks like. The guests clapped politely, murmuring their agreements. My mother leaned across the table, her eyes locking onto mine with a familiar coldness. "Are you taking notes, Haley?" she asked, her tone dripping with intense condescension. "You could learn a lot from your younger sister. Maybe if you paid attention, you could turn your little nature walks into something slightly profitable instead of just scraping by." Courtney laughed, a sharp sound that grated on my nerves. "Oh, Mom, let her be. Not everyone has the relentless drive to run a corporation. Some people are perfectly content being a glorified camp counselor. I mean, somebody has to teach the local Boy Scouts how to rub two sticks together, right?" It is cute that she still likes to play in the dirt at her age. The extended family chuckled politely, though a few of the more decent relatives looked away in discomfort. This was the established dynamic of our family. I was the dedicated punching bag used to constantly elevate Courtney. They needed me to be the failure, so her perceived success would shine even brighter. My father wiped his mouth with a linen napkin and shook his head in my direction. "You are 33 years old, Haley," he stated loudly, making sure the entire table was listening. "You live out in a small cabin in the woods, miles away from civilization. You have zero ambition, zero corporate drive, and absolutely no plan for your future. You waste your time climbing mountains and sleeping in tents while your sister is out here navigating federal contracts and building generational wealth. It is honestly embarrassing to explain to my successful colleagues what my eldest daughter does for a living. I tell them you are finding yourself, but even that weak excuse is wearing incredibly thin after a decade." The words were meant to cut deep, to humiliate me into complete submission. Years ago, this kind of public dressing down would have sent me running to the bathroom in tears. I would have internalized their cruel words and believed that I was truly a massive disappointment. But tonight, their bitter insults felt completely hollow. I sat back in my plush velvet chair, resting my hands calmly in my lap. I did not raise my voice. I did not defend my choices. I simply let their toxic energy wash over me, knowing that their entire reality was built on a remarkably fragile house of cards. They looked at my simple clothing and assumed poverty. They looked at my quiet demeanor and assumed defeat. They had absolutely no clue what I had actually been doing during all those weeks spent in the deep woods. They did not know about the grueling nights, the relentless study, the strategic military partnerships, and the immense physical sacrifices I had made to build something real. As the waiters brought out the next course, I sat quietly holding on to my secret, waiting for the perfect moment to let their manufactured world come crashing down. The dessert plates had barely been cleared from the table when the main event of the evening finally unfolded. A waiter in a crisp white jacket approached the head of the table holding a thick black leather folder. He placed it discreetly near my father, right next to his half-empty glass of expensive scotch. The entire table seemed to collectively hold its breath. We all knew this was not just a dinner. It was a spectacle of wealth, and my parents loved nothing more than an audience when money was involved. Richard picked up the folder and opened it with a theatrical sigh that drew every eye. He pulled out the itemized receipt and scanned the long list of vintage wines, imported steaks, and expensive appetizers. I watched his eyes track down to the final total: $15,000. For a single dinner to celebrate a company that had not even secured a single client yet. He closed the folder with a sharp snap that echoed loudly in the quiet dining room. He did not pull out his wallet. He did not signal the waiter to bring a payment terminal. Instead, he slid the heavy leather folder down the length of the polished mahogany table directly toward me. It stopped right in front of my plate. I stared at the embossed logo on the leather cover, then slowly lifted my gaze to meet my father's eyes. The room went completely dead silent. "You are picking up the tab tonight, Haley," my father announced. He made sure his voice boomed so every single relative at the table could hear him clearly. "You live alone in a tiny wooden cabin in the mountains. You drive a beat-up old truck. You have zero real expenses because you stubbornly refuse to live like a civilized adult. Courtney, on the other hand, is building something substantial. She is carrying the weight of a massive new corporate venture, and she needs her capital for the federal bidding process. It is the absolute least you can do to support your sister, since she is the one actually building a family legacy we can be proud of." My mother nodded vigorously in agreement, her pearl earrings catching the bright chandelier light above us. "Your father is right, Haley," she said. "You have coasted through life without contributing anything meaningful to this family. Paying for your sister's launch party is a small gesture of gratitude for all the years we put up with your rebellious phase. Now be a good sister and take care of the bill so we can finish our champagne in peace." In the past, a moment exactly like this would have broken me. I would have stammered out an excuse or run out of the restaurant in tears, feeling the crushing weight of their public humiliation. But tonight, I felt absolutely nothing but a cold, calculated calm. I did not scream. I did not cry. I did not try to defend myself against their absurd logic. I did not point out that my supposed poverty did not mean I should pay a $15,000 restaurant bill. I simply reached into the front pocket of my olive green shirt and pulled out my wallet. The relatives watched me with bated breath, expecting me to produce a maxed-out credit card or beg my father for a loan. Instead, I extracted a sleek, solid black metal corporate card. It was heavy in my hand, cool to the touch, and completely devoid of any recognizable consumer bank logos. It carried no spending limit, but my family was too busy sneering at my plain clothing to notice the weight or the extreme prestige of the solid metal card I was holding in my hand. I opened the leather folder, placed the heavy black card on top of the receipt, and closed it smoothly. I caught the eye of the waiter who was hovering nearby, looking incredibly uncomfortable with the intense family drama playing out before him. I smiled at him warmly and handed him the folder. "Put it all on this, please, and add a 20% gratuity for the excellent service tonight." The waiter nodded respectfully, taking the heavy folder and rushing off toward the payment terminal. My father smirked, leaning back in his chair and swirling his scotch. "See, Susan," he said to my mother. "I told you she probably had a few thousand stashed away from taking tourists on those little nature walks. It is about time she emptied her pockets for someone who actually matters," he finished. Courtney did not even look at me or utter a single word of thanks. She simply held out her empty glass for another pour of champagne, completely unbothered by the fact that she had just forced her sister to finance her $15,000 ego trip. The waiter returned a few moments later carrying the leather folder. He placed it in front of me with a small, polite bow. I signed the merchant copy with a steady hand, slipped the heavy metal card back into my pocket, and stood up from the table. "Thank you for the lovely evening," I said, my voice perfectly level and devoid of any emotion. "Congratulations on your new business, Courtney. I hope the military finds your business degree as impressive as you do." I turned and walked away from the table, leaving the stunned silence of my extended family behind me. I made my way through the opulent lobby of the country club and pushed through the heavy glass doors into the crisp Denver night air. The valet immediately scurried off to retrieve my heavy-duty off-road truck. I stood under the grand portico, wrapping my canvas jacket tightly around my shoulders, breathing in the freezing mountain air, and letting the profound toxicity of the dining room fade from my mind. But my hard-won peace was incredibly short-lived. Before the valet could even pull my truck around, the doors burst open. The heavy glass doors swung wide as my mother marched out onto the portico, her designer heels clicking sharply against the pavement. She grabbed my arm with a vice-like grip, pulling me roughly away from the valet stand into the shadows of a large decorative stone pillar. "We are not finished here, Haley," she hissed, her eyes narrowing into cold slits. I pulled my arm out of her grasp, smoothing my jacket. "We are perfectly finished, Mom. I paid the absurd bill just like Dad demanded. What else could you possibly want from me tonight?" Susan crossed her arms, her diamond rings flashing brightly under the security lights. "Courtney is submitting her final proposal packet to the Department of Defense tomorrow morning," she stated sharply. "She has the corporate structure, the business degree, and the financial backing," my mother continued. "But the federal procurement officers want to see actual training curriculums. They want tactical survival manuals and medical response protocols to prove she understands the operational scope of the contract." I stared at her, letting the sheer audacity of her demands sink into my brain. "You want my work. You want the wilderness medical manuals I spent years developing." "Yes," she snapped as if I were being slow on purpose. "Do not make this a big deal, Haley. They are just your little outdoor training manuals. It is not like you are protecting state secrets. You typed up some hiking rules and basic first aid tips. Courtney needs them immediately. She needs them to pad her bid and make her company look more robust to the military evaluators. Bring all your binders and digital files to the house first thing tomorrow morning. It is time your little hobby actually benefited this family in a real way." I looked at the woman who raised me, feeling a profound sense of disgust. She had spent my entire life belittling my passions, mocking my skills, and treating my career like a massive joke. Now she was demanding I hand over my intellectual property so her golden child could steal it and pass it off as her own. "No," I said flatly. My mother blinked, clearly shocked that I had dared to use that word. "Excuse me," she asked, her voice rising. I said, "No, Mom. My training manuals are my exclusive property. They are the result of years of grueling fieldwork research and specialized training. I am not handing them over so Courtney can pretend she wrote them to win a federal contract. That is plagiarism and it is federal fraud." My mother stepped closer, her face twisting into an ugly snarl. "You listen to me, you selfish little brat. Your sister is on the verge of securing a multi-million-dollar government contract. She is going to elevate the entire family name. You are going to bring those documents to our house tomorrow morning, or I swear to God, your father will make sure you deeply regret it. He knows people in this town, Haley. He can make your life utterly miserable if you cross him," she threatened. Just then, the valet pulled my muddy, heavily modified truck up to the curb, leaving the engine running. The massive tires and rugged suspension looked entirely out of place next to the line of pristine sports cars and luxury sedans. I turned away from my furious mother and walked down the concrete steps toward my vehicle. "Do not threaten me, Mom," I called back over my shoulder, "and tell Courtney to write her own manuals if she is such a brilliant visionary." I climbed into the high cab of my truck and shut the heavy door, blocking out the sound of my mother screaming my name from the curb. I put the truck into gear immediately. I drove out of the country club gates, leaving the suffocating world of my family in the rearview mirror. As I merged onto the dark highway heading toward the mountains, my phone vibrated in the cup holder. The screen illuminated the dark cab. It was a text message from Courtney. I did not even have to unlock the phone to read the preview on the lock screen. The message was short, vicious, and entirely predictable. I will get them with or without your help, loser. I stared at the glowing words for a brief second before returning my eyes to the dark, winding road ahead. Courtney thought she was dealing with the same weak sister she had bullied for 30 relentless years. She thought she could just take whatever she wanted. She genuinely believed our parents would always clear the path for her, no matter who they had to destroy in the process. She had absolutely no idea what she was about to step into. I pressed my foot down on the accelerator, the powerful engine of my truck roaring to life as I climbed higher into the mountain pass. The war had officially started, and I was fully prepared to watch them burn their own corporate empire to the ground. I smiled, letting the darkness of the mountains swallow my truck completely. I knew the coming days would be brutal, but I was a survival expert. I knew exactly how to navigate treacherous terrain, and my family had just foolishly handed me the perfect map to their total destruction. The winding mountain roads provided the perfect physical distance from the toxic environment of the country club. I drove higher into the Rockies, letting the crisp air clear my mind. My parents genuinely believed I lived in some dilapidated wooden shack, relying on firewood and canned beans to survive. They loved telling their wealthy friends that I was going through an extended rebellious phase, clinging to a bohemian lifestyle that embarrassed them deeply. I never bothered to correct them. Their willful ignorance was my greatest shield. The truth was that my property sat on 400 acres of pristine, heavily guarded private land. As my truck approached the perimeter, a discreet infrared scanner read my license plate and facial biometric data. The massive solid steel gates, completely hidden by a dense tree line, swung open silently. I drove up the perfectly paved driveway that wound through the ancient pines. My home was not a cabin. It was a 15,000 square foot architectural masterpiece, built from glass stone and reclaimed timber. It was completely off the grid, powered by a state-of-the-art solar and geothermal system that I had designed myself. I pulled into the underground garage, parking my muddy truck next to a line of pristine vehicles that I rarely drove. A customized armored sport utility vehicle, a sleek European sports car, and a heavy-duty tactical response vehicle. I stepped out of the truck and walked toward the secure elevator that led directly to my command center. When the elevator doors opened, I stepped into the absolute heart of my secret empire. The entire top floor of the house was a dedicated corporate headquarters, equipped with military-grade encrypted servers, bank after bank of glowing monitors, and massive digital maps tracking global weather patterns and deployment zones. Displayed proudly on the main wall, carved into a massive slab of brushed steel, was my company logo, Apex Survival Solutions. I was not a glorified camp counselor. I was the sole founder and chief executive officer of the premier wilderness tactical and medical survival consulting firm in the United States. My parents thought I was broke because I did not wear designer labels or buy luxury handbags. They had no idea that my personal net worth exceeded $50 million. They had no idea that while Courtney was playing pretend business in her expensive college courses, I was out in the field securing highly classified federal contracts. Apex Survival Solutions provided elite training protocols for search and rescue teams, international border patrols, and specialized military units. My curriculum was not just a collection of hiking rules. It was a meticulously engineered proprietary system that saved lives in the most hostile environments on the planet. I walked past a wall lined with framed commendations, plaques from the Department of Homeland Security, letters of gratitude from governors, and a framed challenge coin from the United States Marine Corps. I had built this entire empire with my own two hands, working 80-hour weeks, bleeding and sweating in the dirt, while my family mocked me from the comfort of their country club dining rooms. Paying that $15,000 restaurant bill earlier tonight had not even been a rounding error in my daily operational budget. It was pocket change. but I kept my wealth entirely hidden. If my parents had known about my massive financial success, they would have swooped in immediately, demanding a cut, claiming they were entitled to the fruits of my labor simply because they gave birth to me. They would have paraded my company around to their friends, taking all the credit for my grueling hard work. By letting them believe I was a massive failure, I had bought myself the ultimate luxury: absolute peace and total autonomy. I tossed my canvas jacket onto a leather sofa and walked over to my primary workstation. The monitors cast a cool blue light across the dark room. I logged into my secure network, checking the status of my active field instructors. I currently had teams deployed in the Alaskan wilderness and the sweltering jungles of South America, running elite survival exercises. Everything was operating perfectly smoothly. I poured myself a glass of cold water and sat down in my ergonomic desk chair, taking a deep breath. Courtney's text message echoed in my mind. She had threatened to get my training manuals with or without my help. I knew my sister was arrogant and deeply entitled, but I also knew she was incredibly lazy. She did not have the discipline or the actual knowledge to write a single page of a tactical survival manual. If she truly intended to submit a bid to the Department of Defense by tomorrow morning, she would need comprehensive, detailed documentation. She would need exact protocols, risk assessment matrices, and emergency medical procedures. Things that took years of practical experience to develop. I leaned back in my chair, running a hand through my hair. I assumed she would simply try to hire a cheap ghostwriter online, or perhaps attempt to hack into my public-facing website to copy whatever basic brochures I had published there. I had military-grade firewalls protecting my core intellectual property, so a cyber attack from a desperate business student did not worry me in the slightest. I was fully prepared to watch her fail spectacularly on her own merits. I closed my eyes for a brief moment, letting the quiet hum of the servers soothe my nerves. Suddenly, the sharp ring of my secure satellite phone shattered the silence of the command center. I opened my eyes, instantly alert. Very few people had the number to this specific phone, and none of them would be calling at this hour unless it was a matter of national security or a severe operational emergency. I picked up the heavy encrypted handset and pressed the green connection button. "This is Haley," I answered, my voice dropping into my professional command tone. "Haley, it is Liam." The deep, steady voice on the other end of the line sent a sudden wave of warmth through my chest despite the late hour. It was Major Liam Caldwell calling directly from his office at the Department of Defense in Washington. Liam was not just a military contact. He was the man who had quite literally saved my life in the Sierra Nevada mountains 6 months ago, and the man I had been quietly and happily dating ever since. "Liam, it is late on the East Coast," I said, a genuine smile replacing the tension that had been gripping my jaw all night. "Are you working the graveyard shift at the Pentagon again?" "I am," he replied, but his voice lacked the usual warm banter we shared during our late-night calls. His tone was dead serious, strictly business. "Something is wrong." I sat up straight, instantly switching from girlfriend back to CEO. "What is going on, Liam? Has there been an incident with one of the deployed training units?" "No, the field teams are fine," he said quickly. "This is about a contracting issue. I am currently sitting at my desk reviewing the preliminary electronic submissions for the new Special Operations Winter Survival Training contract. The bidding window officially closes tomorrow morning, but several companies have submitted their digital packets early for initial compliance review." "Okay," I said, furrowing my brow. "I submitted the Apex proposal 3 days ago." "I know you did," Liam replied. "I reviewed your packet myself. It is flawless as always, but I'm looking at another submission that came through the secure portal just an hour ago. It is from a newly registered corporate entity out of Denver called Summit Defense." I felt the air leave my lungs. My grip on the satellite phone tightened until my knuckles turned white. "Liam," I whispered, my mind racing. "Tell me what you are looking at." "I am looking at a 50-page operational manual," Liam said, his voice growing tighter with protective anger. "Haley, the curriculum, the medical protocols, the terrain risk assessments, the evacuation algorithms. It is a word-for-word, exact copy of your proprietary training system. The formatting has been changed, and they slapped a cheap graphic logo on the header, but the core data is yours. Every single word. The silence in my command center felt deafening. My sister had not hired a ghostwriter. She had not scraped my public website. She had somehow acquired the exact, highly classified internal operational manuals that I only distributed to cleared federal personnel. My mind spun trying to calculate how she could have possibly breached my security protocols. "I keep everything locked down, Liam," I said, my voice trembling with a mixture of shock and rising fury. "The only physical copies of those specific manuals are locked inside a fireproof safe in my home office," Haley, Liam said softly, cutting through my racing thoughts. "The primary contact listed on this federal bidding document is Courtney." He paused, letting the weight of the name sink in. "I need you to answer me honestly. Did you partner with your sister on this contract?" "No," I said, my voice dropping to a dangerous, icy whisper. "No, Liam. I absolutely did not partner with my sister." He let out a heavy breath on the other end of the line. "Then we have a massive problem, Haley. Because Summit Defense just submitted stolen intellectual property on an official federal bidding document to the United States military." I closed my eyes, feeling a cold, ruthless determination settle deep into my bones. Courtney had always been a bully and a manipulator, but this was a completely different battlefield. She had just crossed a line that she could never uncross. I asked Liam to give me exactly 5 minutes to pull my internal server access logs. I placed the heavy encrypted receiver back onto its cradle and leaned forward, resting my elbows on the polished steel surface of my desk. My heart hammered against my ribs, a steady rhythm of adrenaline and disbelief. I needed to focus. I needed to suppress the immediate surge of familial betrayal and approach this like the tactical survival expert I was. My eyes drifted across the dark surface of my workstation and locked onto a small, heavy object resting next to my keyboard. It was a bronze United States Marine Corps Challenge coin. Its polished surface gleamed faintly in the cool blue light of the monitors. I reached out and traced the raised eagle globe and anchor emblem with my thumb. Instantly, the sterile environment of my command center faded away. The memory pulled me back exactly 6 months to a place where the cold was not just a temperature, but a physical enemy. Bridgeport, California, the Marine Corps Mountain Warfare Training Center. It was mid-February, and the Sierra Nevada mountains were locked in the grip of a brutal, unyielding winter. I had been contracted to lead a highly specialized high-altitude winter survival course for an elite Marine reconnaissance unit. These were some of the most hardened, capable warriors on the planet, and I was the civilian instructor tasked with pushing them past their absolute limits. I had spent 2 weeks running them through grueling drills in deep snow, teaching them how to build snow caves, how to forage for calories in a frozen wasteland, and how to treat severe cold weather injuries with limited medical supplies. Major Liam Caldwell was the commanding officer overseeing the exercise. At the time, he was just a military liaison assigned to evaluate my proprietary curriculum for future Department of Defense integration. He was stoic, intensely focused, and radiated a quiet, commanding authority that demanded instant respect. From the moment I stepped onto the training ground, I could feel his eyes on me. He did not look at me with the skepticism I usually received from military men encountering a civilian female instructor. He watched me with intense analytical respect. He absorbed every technique I demonstrated, and he led his men by example, never asking them to endure a hardship he was not willing to face himself. During those first 2 weeks, we had shared brief conversations over military rations and maps, realizing quickly that we shared a mutual dedication to discipline and survival. On the final day of the field exercise, the mountain decided to remind us who was truly in charge. We were conducting a high-ridge navigation drill at an elevation of 10,000 feet. The weather forecast had predicted light snow, but the Sierra Nevadas are notoriously unpredictable. Within a matter of 20 minutes, the sky turned a bruised purple and the wind abruptly shifted. A massive, fast-moving front slammed into our position, bringing a catastrophic whiteout blizzard. The temperature plummeted to 20 degrees below zero, and the wind howled at 60 miles per hour, whipping the snow into a blinding frenzy. Visibility dropped to absolute zero. I shouted orders over the deafening roar of the storm, initiating emergency protocol. We needed to descend to the secondary rally point below the tree line, where we had cached emergency shelters. I took the lead, navigating blindly by compass and memory-breaking trail through thigh-deep snow. Liam was right behind me, keeping the recon unit in a tight, disciplined formation. We were moving carefully across a narrow ridgeline when the terrain betrayed me. Beneath the fresh powder lay a hidden, fractured ice shelf. I planted my boots, taking a heavy step forward to test the depth, but the ice gave way with a sharp, violent crack. The ground simply vanished beneath my feet. I fell hard, tumbling down a steep, jagged incline of rock and ice. The world spun in a chaotic blur of white and gray as I slammed against the unforgiving mountainside. I slid for 40 agonizing feet before a dense cluster of frozen pine branches halted my descent. I lay there in the deep snow, gasping for air, as a sickening, blinding pain erupted in my right knee. I was a wilderness medical expert. I did not need an imaging machine to know the damage was severe. I had completely shattered my patella and torn multiple ligaments. My leg was pinned at an unnatural angle, and the pain was so intense it threatened to pull me into unconsciousness. Above me, the storm raged on, burying my tracks in seconds. I reached for my radio, but the impact had smashed the device against a rock, rendering it useless. For the first time in my entire professional career, I felt the cold grip of genuine terror. I knew exactly how quickly a human body shuts down in sub-zero temperatures when mobility is lost. If they could not find me in the whiteout, I would freeze to death in less than an hour. I gritted my teeth, dragging myself upward, trying to claw my way up the icy slope with my bare hands. Every movement sent shockwaves of agony through my shattered knee. Then a dark figure materialized through the blinding snow. It was Major Liam Caldwell. He had rappelled down the treacherous incline, risking his own life in the zero-visibility storm to find me. He crashed through the frozen branches, falling to his knees in the deep snow beside me. He did not panic. He did not waste time asking unnecessary questions. He stripped off his heavy thermal gloves to rapidly assess my leg, his hands moving with precise, calculated efficiency. When he saw the unnatural angle of my knee, his jaw tightened into a hard, resolute line. The protocol for an injury of this magnitude in a severe blizzard was to secure the casualty in a thermal bivouac sack and wait for a specialized medical evacuation team. But the storm was upgrading to a category that would ground all helicopters for at least 24 hours. Waiting meant certain death. Liam looked up at the howling sky and then down at me. "We are not waiting," he yelled over the screaming wind. "We are moving now." He stabilized my leg with a rigid splint fashioned from his tactical poles, wrapping it tight with survival tape. Then, without a moment of hesitation, he pulled me upward, hoisting my entire body weight onto his back in a fireman carry. I protested, telling him the incline was too steep, that the snow was too deep for him to carry a fully geared adult. I told him he would exhaust his own core temperature and jeopardize his life. Liam simply adjusted his grip on my arms, locking me securely against his broad shoulders. "I do not leave my people behind," he growled, his voice vibrating against my chest. "And I am sure as hell not leaving you." The journey back to the extraction point was a grueling, agonizing display of sheer human willpower. For 2 brutal hours, Liam carried me through the heart of the blizzard. The wind battered us relentlessly, driving ice crystals into our skin like tiny needles. Every step he took through the waist-deep snow required superhuman effort. I could hear his ragged breathing. I could feel his muscles trembling from the extreme exertion, but he never stopped. He pushed through the freezing pain, refusing to let the mountain win. I kept talking to him, fighting off the encroaching darkness of hypothermia, giving him navigational headings based on the subtle shifts in the wind direction. When we finally breached the tree line and collapsed into the emergency tactical shelter, the rest of the recon unit was waiting to receive us. The heavy insulated doors sealed shut, blocking out the deadly storm. The medics instantly swarmed us, cutting away our frozen gear and wrapping us in heated thermal blankets. I was shivering violently, my lips tinged blue, the pain in my shattered knee radiating up my spine. Liam dropped to the floor beside my cot, refusing medical attention until he knew my core temperature was stabilizing. His face was pale, his dark hair plastered to his forehead, with freezing sweat, and his hands were raw and blistered from the cold. He leaned over me, pulling the heated blanket tight around my shoulders. His dark eyes locked onto mine, fierce and protective. I stared up at this man who had just pushed his body past the brink of destruction simply to keep me alive. The intense respect we had built over the past 2 weeks had forged into something much deeper out there in the ice. I was breathless fighting the pain, but I managed a weak, exhausted smile. I reached out from under the heavy blankets and rested my shaking hand against his cold cheek. "Whoever marries you will be a lucky woman," I whispered, my voice raspy and entirely sincere. Liam did not pull away. He did not offer a stoic military dismissal. He leaned in closer, his face just inches from mine. The intensity in his eyes stripped away all the professional boundaries we had maintained. He brushed a damp strand of hair from my forehead, his thumb lingering against my temple. "I hoped it would be you," he whispered back, his voice cutting right through the chaotic noise of the crowded medical shelter. That moment in the freezing Sierra Nevada mountains changed the entire trajectory of my life. It was the catalyst that shifted us from professional colleagues to quiet, fiercely loyal partners. Over the past 6 months, we had navigated my grueling physical rehabilitation and his demanding Pentagon schedule, keeping our relationship strictly private. Liam was the only person in the world who truly understood the weight I carried, the only one who saw the woman beneath the armor. He had proven his loyalty in the most extreme conditions imaginable. He was my partner, my equal, and my strongest ally. The memory faded, pulling me back to the present reality of my dark command center. The bronze challenge coin in my hand felt warm now. The stark contrast between Liam's profound loyalty and my own biological family's sickening betrayal crystallized in my mind. My parents and my sister had never once tried to carry me. They had only ever tried to push me down the mountain. They viewed my life as a joke and my hard work as something to be stolen and exploited for their own gain. They had deeply underestimated who they were dealing with. I was no longer the outcast daughter seeking their elusive approval. I was the chief executive officer of Apex Survival Solutions. I had survived avalanches, blizzards, and the harshest terrain on Earth. A superficial smear campaign orchestrated by a lazy business student and 2 status-obsessed parents was nothing but a minor obstacle in my path. I placed the challenge coin firmly back onto my desk. I picked up the encrypted satellite phone and pressed the redial button. The line connected immediately. "Liam," I said, my voice completely steady, radiating absolute lethal focus. "I need to run a full diagnostic on my home security logs to confirm exactly how they breached my physical perimeter. But I can promise you this: Courtney did not act alone. My parents are directly involved in this theft. I will not let them get away with submitting fraudulent documents to the federal government. I want to build an impenetrable case before we strike back." Liam agreed immediately. "I need undeniable proof, Haley," he said, his voice shifting back into that calm, tactical precision I relied on. "The Department of Defense does not operate on family drama. We operate on hard evidence. If I am going to flag the Summit Defense bid for fraudulent intellectual property, I need an airtight chain of custody showing exactly how your sister acquired those documents. I will get it, I promised." I terminated the connection and placed the satellite phone down on the cold steel of my desk. The command center felt different now, less like a sanctuary and more like a war room. I spun my chair toward the primary security terminal and rapidly typed in my master override credentials. My fingers flew across the keyboard, pulling up the digital firewall logs from the past 30 days. I scanned the scrolling lines of green code looking for any unauthorized remote access attempts or brute force attacks that might have compromised my network. The firewall was completely pristine. There had not been a single digital intrusion. My cybersecurity protocols were military grade, and Courtney lacked the technical sophistication to attempt a cyber attack. That left only one terrifyingly logical explanation. The breach was not digital. It was physical. Someone had walked directly into my home and taken the data. I pulled up the physical security logs, accessing the hidden cameras I had installed both outside the perimeter and inside the main living areas of the house. My parents believed my home was just a rustic cabin because I deliberately designed the ground floor to look like a simple upscale mountain retreat. They did not know about the reinforced steel doors, the biometric scanners, or the hidden elevator leading to my command center. But they did know about the downstairs study, where I kept decoy files and older printed copies of my field manuals. I adjusted the video feed, dialing it back to earlier this evening, right around the time I had been sitting at the country club enduring their insults. The video feed buffered before displaying the front driveway in crisp, high-definition night vision. I watched the timestamp tick forward in fast-forward mode. At exactly 7:15, roughly the time the waiter was serving the Wagyu beef tartare at the restaurant, a vehicle pulled up to my front gate. I paused the video and zoomed in. It was my father driving his pristine luxury sport utility vehicle. The realization hit me like a physical blow to the chest. My parents had not just orchestrated that lavish dinner to celebrate Courtney. They had orchestrated it as a deliberate tactical distraction. They needed me out of the house and pinned down in a public setting. They purposefully demanded my presence at the country club, knowing I would be trapped while they carried out their theft. I hit play on the video feed. I watched my mother step out of the passenger side of the vehicle. She was wearing dark athletic clothing and running shoes instead of her tight designer dress. My father stepped out of the driver's side wearing similar dark clothing. They walked quickly up the stone path to my front door. I switched the camera angle to the front porch feed. My father reached into his pocket and pulled out a silver key. It was the emergency spare key I had given them 3 years ago, when I first bought the property. I had given it to them, out of a lingering sense of familial duty, hoping they would want to visit me. They had never used it once. Until tonight. I watched my father insert the key into the deadbolt. He turned it, and the heavy wooden door swung open. They stepped inside my home, moving with a rushed, frantic energy that completely contradicted their usual refined country club demeanor. I switched the feed to the interior hallway cameras tracking their movements as they bypassed the kitchen and headed straight down the corridor. They did not hesitate or look around. They knew exactly where they were going. They walked directly into my ground floor study. This room was decorated with topographic maps, wooden bookshelves, and a heavy oak desk to maintain the illusion of my simple lifestyle. I switched to the camera mounted in the corner of the study. My mother immediately went to the bookshelf, while my father moved behind the desk. "Look for the black binders," my mother hissed, her voice captured with crystal clarity by the audio microphones. "Courtney said the medical protocols are in the black binders." I watched my mother pull 3 thick black binders off the shelf. These were the printed hard copies of my wilderness trauma response curriculum. They contained step-by-step tactical medical procedures I had spent 7 years developing, testing, and refining in the field. She shoved the heavy binders into a large canvas tote bag she brought with her. Meanwhile, my father was rummaging through the drawers of my oak desk. He pulled out 2 external hard drives. These drives contained the digital backups of the printed manuals and the comprehensive risk assessment algorithms Courtney needed for her federal bid. "Got them," my father said, shoving the hard drives into his jacket pocket. "Let us get out of here before she decides to leave that dinner early." They turned and practically ran out of the study. I switched the cameras back to the front porch, watching them lock the door and hurry back to their luxury vehicle. The entire physical breach from the moment they arrived to when they drove away took exactly 4 minutes and 20 seconds. They robbed their own daughter with the ruthless efficiency of common criminals. I sat staring at the frozen frame of my parents driving away with my intellectual property. The depth of their betrayal was staggering. They had not just stolen documents. They stole my entire life work to hand it over to the sister who bullied me since childhood. I took a deep, stabilizing breath, pushing the devastation aside. There would be time to mourn the complete death of my family later. Right now, I had a corporate empire to protect and a trap to set. I turned back to my keyboard and initiated a total system lockdown. I changed every physical access code on the property, disabling the deadbolt that the spare key operated. I activated the secondary biometric locks on all interior doors and armed the perimeter motion sensors. No one would step foot on my property again without triggering a massive security response. Next, I moved to the digital infrastructure. The external hard drives my father stole were heavily encrypted, but I was not taking any chances. I accessed the master control terminal and executed a targeted remote wipe protocol. The moment Courtney attempted to plug those stolen hard drives into an internet-connected device, my security software would instantly flag her location and lock down the files. She would only be able to access the specific unencrypted read-only portable document format files that were explicitly meant for the bidding packet. Everything else on those drives, the sensitive client data, the financial records, and the instructor deployment schedules, would be inaccessible to her. I wanted her to have the manuals. I wanted her to submit them to the Department of Defense, because that was the exact mechanism that would trigger her destruction. But I was not going to let her see the inner workings of my company. Once the digital and physical perimeters were absolutely secure, I grabbed my phone. It was time to bring in the heavy artillery. I did not call the local police. Filing a standard burglary report would only result in a messy, slow-moving family dispute that my father could easily manipulate with his expensive lawyers. I needed a tactical legal strike. I dialed the direct personal number of Diane. Diane was my corporate attorney, a ruthless, incredibly brilliant legal strategist who charged exorbitant hourly rates and destroyed opposing counsel. She answered on the second ring despite the incredibly late hour. "Haley," she answered, her voice sharp and immediately alert. "Tell me you have a highly lucrative emergency for me tonight." "I have a massive corporate espionage case," I replied firmly, transmitting the video files to her secure server. "My parents broke into my home and stole proprietary medical training curriculums for my sister to use on a federal contract bid. I need you to verify that my interior surveillance footage is legally admissible in a federal court of law." I heard Diane rapidly clicking her keyboard as she accessed the highly encrypted video files. She watched the footage in total silence for several intense seconds. "Oh, this is absolutely perfect!" Diane finally declared, her voice dripping with sheer predatory anticipation. "You have clear video, crisp audio, and time-stamped proof of physical theft. This is entirely admissible, Haley. Lock everything down absolutely immediately. We have a trap to set." I ended the call with Diane taking a deep breath. The trap was set digitally, but I needed one final maneuver. Confronting them face to face would force them to actively defend their theft, ensuring they owned their crime. I grabbed my keys and chose my armored sport utility vehicle. The drive down the mountain and into the wealthy Denver suburbs took 45 minutes. I navigated the manicured streets of my parents' neighborhood and parked in their circular driveway directly behind my father's pristine luxury vehicle. The exact same car I had watched on my security footage hours ago. I used the security code they had given me years ago, which they clearly never bothered to change. The heavy mahogany door clicked open, and I stepped inside the immaculate house. I walked past the grand staircase and headed straight for the kitchen. My parents were sitting at their large marble island. My mother was sipping from a porcelain coffee cup while scrolling a tablet. My father was reading a financial newspaper. They had committed a felony burglary less than 8 hours ago, yet they sat there looking completely relaxed. My heavy boots made a dull thud against the Italian tile, alerting them to my presence. My father lowered his newspaper in surprise. My mother nearly spilled her coffee, her hand flying to her chest in a theatrical display of shock. Haley, she gasped. What on earth are you doing here so early? I thought you went back to your little cabin to sulk after dinner. I walked slowly toward the island, planting my feet shoulder-width apart. I want my property back, I said, my voice dangerously calm. The pleasant morning atmosphere vanished instantly, replaced by thick, suffocating tension. My parents exchanged a rapid, panicked glance before rearranging their faces into masks of bewilderment. I have no idea what you are talking about, Haley, my father said smoothly, folding his newspaper. You barge into our home making ridiculous demands. Have you lost your mind? I stared directly into his eyes, refusing to back down. You drove your vehicle to my property at 7:15 last night, I stated. You used the emergency spare key I gave you 3 years ago. You entered my ground floor study. Mom took 3 printed black binders containing my wilderness medical protocols. You took 2 external hard drives from my oak desk. You were inside my home for exactly 4 minutes and 20 seconds. I want my property back right now. My mother stood up from her bar stool, her face flushing angry red. She did not express remorse. Instead, she launched into a vicious counterattack, leaning heavily on her classic gaslighting tactics. You are being incredibly dramatic, Haley, she snapped, waving her hand dismissively. We did not steal anything. We are family and family shares resources. We simply borrowed some of your notes because your sister needed them for an important project. You refused to help her last night, so your father and I had to step in and act like the supportive adults you refused to be. I felt a cold knot form in my stomach. You broke into my home and took my intellectual property, I countered, keeping my tone icy. That is not sharing, Mom. That is felony theft. My mother slammed her hand down on the marble countertop. Stop throwing around ridiculous legal terms, she yelled. You do not own intellectual property, Haley. You run a glorified hobby. You take people on nature walks and teach them how to tie knots. Courtney, on the other hand, has a real business degree from a prestigious university. She is building a legitimate corporate enterprise. She can actually monetize your little hiking notes and turn them into something highly valuable. You should be thanking her on your knees for taking your amateur paperwork and giving it some actual real-world value. The profound delusion in her words was staggering. You think my trauma response algorithms are just hiking notes, I asked. You think she can submit my work to the federal government and claim she wrote it? My mother crossed her arms, looking at me with absolute contempt. She will adapt them, my mother insisted stubbornly. She will use her corporate expertise to format them properly for the military evaluators. It is called collaboration, Haley, something you would understand if you ever bothered to learn how to operate in a civilized business environment instead of hiding in the woods like a feral animal. We did what we had to do to secure her future. My father stood up, joining my mother to form an impenetrable wall of toxic enablement. He puffed out his chest, trying to use his physical presence to intimidate me. This conversation is over, Haley, he declared, booming with forced authority. Courtney already has the drives and binders. She is integrating them into her final bidding packet right now. She will submit her proposal to the Department of Defense by 8 o'clock this morning. You are going to go back to your cabin and stay quiet. If you want my property, you will have to return it, I said, standing my ground, or I will report the theft. My father let out a harsh, mocking laugh. Report it to who? The local police, he sneered, stepping closer to me. Go ahead and try. Let me tell you exactly what will happen if you attempt to sabotage your sister's bid out of petty jealousy. I will call my corporate legal team. I will retain the most expensive, ruthless attorneys in this state, and I will bury you in defamation lawsuits. He pointed a thick finger directly at my face, his eyes burning with malice. I will drag you through civil court until you are absolutely bankrupt. I will tie you up in endless litigation for the next 10 years. I will tell the judge you are suffering from a severe mental breakdown and trying to extort your successful sister because you are bitter about your own failed life. Who do you think the courts will believe, Haley? A wealthy, respected businessman with deep ties to the local community? Or a solitary woman living in the woods who claims her family stole her camping brochures? You do not have the money or the social capital to fight me. If you try to ruin Courtney's future, I will personally make sure you never recover financially or socially. Do you understand me? He was fully prepared to destroy my life, bankrupt me, and drag my name through the mud simply to protect his golden child. He was weaponizing his wealth to crush me into submission. I looked at my father and then at my mother. I searched their faces looking for any trace of parental love or any small shred of moral decency. There was absolutely nothing. Their eyes were cold, hard, and entirely devoid of empathy. They were just two ruthless, status-obsessed people who viewed me as nothing more than a disposable resource to be exploited whenever Courtney needed a stepping stone. A profound sense of clarity washed over me, replacing the lingering ache of childhood rejection. I had spent years hoping they would eventually respect me. But standing in their pristine kitchen, listening to them threaten to destroy my life to cover up a felony, I realized the absolute truth. My family was entirely beyond saving. They were toxic, rotten to their core, and completely beyond redemption. I did not need to scream or fight them anymore. I had gotten exactly what I came for. I had forced them to admit to the theft, and I had confirmed that Courtney was actively using my materials for the federal bid. The trap was locked, and they had just gleefully handed me the key. I slowly lowered my hands and took a step back from the marble island. "You are right, Dad," I said, my voice dropping to a soft whisper. "I am just a woman living in the woods. You should absolutely underestimate me." My father smirked, thinking he had successfully intimidated me into submission. "That is a smart girl," he said, adjusting his collar. "Now run along home. We have a major corporate victory to celebrate today." I turned my back on them and walked out of the kitchen, my boots echoing on the Italian tile one last time. I walked out the front door and down the stone path to my armored vehicle. I climbed into the driver's seat and started the heavy engine. I did not look back at the mansion as I drove away. I did not shed a single tear for the parents I had just permanently lost. I merged onto the highway and pulled out my encrypted phone. I sent a single text message to Diane. They confessed to everything and threatened to bury me in court. Let them submit the bid. We are going to war. I returned to my mountain sanctuary and immediately headed for the command center. The large digital clock on the wall glowed with the early morning hours. I sat in my ergonomic chair and pulled up the encrypted monitoring software I had secretly attached to the read-only files on the stolen hard drives. A small green indicator light flashed on my primary monitor. Courtney had done it. She had officially uploaded the stolen training curriculum to the Department of Defense procurement portal. The federal trap was officially primed, but my sister was about to realize that stealing paperwork was only the first step in a highly complex military bidding process. By noon, my secure communication channels began to light up with incoming reports from my senior field instructors. Courtney had apparently read the fine print of the federal bid requirements and discovered a massive, glaring hole in her manufactured corporate facade. The Department of Defense did not just evaluate training manuals. They required a comprehensive roster of certified specialized tactical instructors who held active security clearances and verified wilderness medicine credentials. Courtney had a brand new empty company. She had absolutely zero personnel to actually execute the training. Instead of backing down, my sister doubled down, using the only weapon she actually possessed, which was our parents' vast wealth. Courtney launched an aggressive, desperate poaching campaign against my company. She somehow scraped the names of my independent contractors from old public permit filings and began cold calling my top-tier survival experts. My lead instructor, Caleb, called me from a satellite phone in the Alaskan tundra to report the bizarre interaction. He told me a frantic woman named Courtney had just offered him 3 times his standard operational day rate to sign an exclusivity contract with Summit Defense. She was promising him $3,000 a day, plus massive signing bonuses funded entirely by Richard's personal bank accounts. Caleb was fiercely loyal to Apex Survival Solutions, and he asked me if I wanted him to tell her to go to hell. I smiled at the monitor, my mind working through the tactical geometry of the situation. I gave Caleb an order that completely shocked him. I told him to accept her offer, and to quietly tell the other independent contractors to do the same. I explained that they should sign the preliminary letters of intent and collect those massive non-refundable signing bonuses directly from my father's accounts. I wanted Courtney to think she was winning. I wanted her to believe she was successfully gutting my company and building her own elite roster. More importantly, I wanted Richard to bleed his own liquid assets dry funding a fraudulent federal bid that was destined to explode in his face. Let them drain their wealth paying my people, I told Caleb. Take the money and wait for my signal. While Courtney was frantically trying to buy a workforce, my parents were launching a synchronized psychological attack on another front. Richard and Susan were not stupid people. They knew that I possessed the capacity to expose their theft and ruin Courtney's pristine reputation. To prevent me from being believed, they needed to systematically destroy my credibility. They needed to ensure that if I ever spoke out against them, nobody in our extended family or their influential social circles would ever listen to a single word I said. They initiated a vicious, highly coordinated smear campaign designed to paint me as an unhinged, bitter outcast. The execution of their character assassination was ruthless. My mother began making tearful phone calls to every aunt, uncle, and cousin in our extensive family tree. She manufactured a completely fabricated narrative claiming that I was suffering from a severe mental breakdown. She told them that living isolated in the woods had finally fractured my grip on reality. According to Susan, I had become violently jealous of Courtney's new business venture, and I was threatening to extort the family for money. She painted Courtney as the brilliant, hard-working victim and me as the deranged, jealous older sister who was trying to sabotage her out of pure spite. My father handled their wealthy social circle and professional contacts. He attended his country club lunches and board meetings, shaking his head with manufactured parental sorrow. He told his influential peers that his eldest daughter had tragically lost her mind. He claimed I was deeply in debt from my failed outdoor hobby and was now attempting to blackmail his successful younger daughter. Richard warned them that I might reach out with wild, fabricated stories about stolen documents, but that they should ignore my desperate pleas for attention. They built an impenetrable fortress of lies around my character, effectively preempting any attempt I might make to defend myself. The fallout from their smear campaign was immediate and overwhelmingly toxic. By late afternoon, my personal cell phone began to vibrate constantly with incoming text messages from extended family members. These were people who had never bothered to check on me or ask about my life, but who were now entirely eager to participate in my public execution. I sat in the dim light of my command center watching the messages scroll across my screen. The sheer volume of vitriol was staggering. My Aunt Cheryl texted me to say she was utterly disgusted by my behavior. She told me that trying to extort my own parents was the lowest form of betrayal and suggested I check myself into a psychiatric facility immediately. My cousin David sent a long, rambling message calling me a bitter failure who could not handle seeing Courtney succeed. He told me to stay away from the family and warned me that nobody would ever believe my desperate lies. Message after message poured in, each one echoing the exact narrative my parents had carefully planted. They called me toxic, ungrateful, and deranged. They praised Courtney for her ambition and offered her their full support against my supposed harassment. In the past, a coordinated attack of this magnitude from my own blood relatives would have completely shattered my resolve. I would have felt the desperate, frantic urge to reply to every single message, to defend my character, and to beg them to see the truth. I would have sent paragraphs of explanations trying to convince them that my parents were the actual criminals. But I was no longer that frightened, discarded daughter seeking validation from a family that inherently despised me. I knew that engaging with them would only fuel their manufactured drama. Arguing with a smear campaign only gives it oxygen. I placed my phone face up on the steel desk and watched the screen light up with notification after notification. I absorbed every single blow. I read every cruel insult, every misinformed judgment, and every vicious accusation. I let the toxicity wash over me, acknowledging the profound betrayal, but refusing to let it penetrate my armor. I did not type a single response. I did not try to defend myself or explain the federal trap I had just set. I maintained absolute unnerving radio silence. This complete lack of response deeply unsettled my parents. They thrived on conflict and fed on emotional reactions. They expected me to scream to cry to launch a messy public defense that they could easily swat down with their expensive lawyers. My silence was a tactical maneuver they could not comprehend. By refusing to engage, I was denying them the very ammunition they needed to prove I was unhinged. I sat alone in the quiet hum of my corporate headquarters, a vault of silence in the face of their relentless noise. As the evening sun dipped below the jagged peaks of the Rocky Mountains, plunging my estate into shadow, I reviewed the strategic board in my mind. Courtney had submitted the stolen intellectual property to the Department of Defense. She had foolishly committed to exorbitant financial contracts with my loyal instructors, draining my father's accounts. My parents had successfully poisoned the entire extended family against me, isolating me completely from their social sphere. They believed they had won the war before I even fired a single shot. They believed they had effectively buried me alive. I poured myself a fresh cup of black coffee and pulled up the encrypted messaging application on my secure terminal. I had absorbed their best psychological hits, and my perimeter was completely secure. It was time to coordinate the final strike. I watched the green light on my server monitor, blinking steadily, confirming that the federal procurement portal had officially locked Courtney's submission into the government database. The digital chain of custody was now a matter of permanent federal record. I took a deep breath, savoring the quiet power of total control. I was ready to let them celebrate their fabricated victory while the federal guillotine slowly lowered directly over their heads. The command center remained perfectly still, save for the soft clicking of my keyboard as I archived the incoming hateful messages into a dedicated evidence folder. Every toxic text, every cruel voicemail, and every defamatory email was meticulously logged and time-stamped. They thought they were punishing me, but they were simply handing my corporate attorney an airtight case for intentional infliction of emotional distress and targeted defamation. I leaned back in my chair, feeling a profound sense of peace. The silence in the room was not the sound of my defeat. It was the sound of my absolute impending victory. Let them talk. Let them spread their vicious rumors. The truth was coming for them, and it was wearing a uniform. The following evening, I stood on the back deck of my mountain estate, watching the headlights of a solitary vehicle wind its way up my private road. The heavy armored gates had recognized the clearance codes and allowed the dark government-issued sport utility vehicle to pass through the perimeter without incident. I wrapped my heavy woolen sweater tighter against the biting mountain chill, but the cold I felt had nothing to do with the weather. It was the icy anticipation of a battle that was about to cross from a bitter family dispute into a full-blown federal investigation. The vehicle pulled into my underground garage, and a few moments later, the private elevator hummed to life. The doors slid open, revealing Major Liam Caldwell. He stepped out into my command center, but tonight, he was not wearing the casual outdoor gear he usually favored when visiting me in Colorado. He was in his full-service Alpha uniform, his chest heavy with ribbons and commendations projecting an aura of absolute unyielding military authority. He looked dangerously handsome and incredibly serious. I moved across the polished floor and wrapped my arms around him, burying my face against his shoulder. He held me tightly, his strong hands pressing firmly against my back, grounding me in a reality that felt like it was spinning out of control. "Liam," I whispered, pulling back to look into his dark, intense eyes. "I am so glad you are here." He reached up and brushed a stray lock of hair behind my ear, his touch surprisingly gentle given the rigid uniform he wore. "I came as quickly as I could, Haley," he said, his voice low and steady. "Officially, I am here in Denver to conduct a preliminary site inspection for a new bidding contractor called Summit Defense. Unofficially, I am here to make sure you understand exactly what kind of hellfire is about to rain down on your family." I led him over to the heavy oak desk, pulling up two leather chairs. I poured us both a glass of dark roast coffee from the carafe I had prepared earlier. "I already know what my sister did, Liam," I said, taking a sip of the bitter liquid. "She stole my proprietary training manuals and uploaded them to the Department of Defense procurement portal. My parents broke into this house to get them. I have the entire physical breach documented on high-definition security footage." Liam leaned forward, resting his forearms on the desk, his expression hardening into stone. It is worse than simple theft, Haley. The moment Courtney hit the submit button on that federal portal, she crossed a legal threshold that she cannot ever uncross. He pulled a thick manila folder from his leather briefcase and placed it squarely on my desk. He opened it, revealing a printout of Courtney's entire bidding packet. My heart hammered against my ribs as I looked at my own life work stamped with my sister's cheap, amateurish logo. I need you to understand the true severity of this situation. Haley, Liam stated, his tone dropping into a grave professional cadence. The Department of Defense requires all contractors to sign a sworn affidavit certifying under penalty of perjury that the intellectual property submitted in their bid is entirely their own original work. They are also required to certify that they have the legal right to distribute any proprietary tactical information contained within the packet. Courtney digitally signed both of those affidavits. I stared at the paperwork, the reality of the situation clicking sharply into place. She lied on a sworn federal document, I said, my voice tight with disbelief. She committed perjury. Yes, Liam confirmed, his dark eyes locking onto mine. And because she transmitted that stolen data across state lines using a secure federal internet portal, she also committed federal wire fraud. This is not a civil lawsuit over a stolen camping brochure, Haley. This is a severe criminal offense. Defrauding the United States military during an active contracting process carries mandatory minimum prison sentences. If we proceed with this, the federal government will not just fine your sister, they will indict her. The immense weight of his words settled heavily over the command center. My parents thought they were just being clever business people, using their wealth to bulldoze my career and elevate their golden child. They believed they were playing a harsh but acceptable corporate game. They had absolutely no comprehension of the devastating federal machinery they had just recklessly triggered. Liam reached across the desk and covered my hand with his own, his thumb tracing a soothing circle against my knuckles. I need you to be absolutely certain about this, Haley, he said, his voice softening slightly, but losing none of its intense focus. The Department of Defense Inspector General is already reviewing the metadata from her submission. Once I hand over your security footage, verifying the chain of custody, the federal authorities will take complete control of the investigation. He paused, letting the silence stretch between us, allowing me to fully absorb the gravity of the choice before me. If I submit this evidence, it will completely destroy your family, Liam warned gently. The criminal charges against Courtney will be overwhelming. Your parents will be implicated as active co-conspirators in the physical burglary and the subsequent corporate espionage. Their business reputations will be permanently shattered. Their social standing will vanish overnight. The federal government will likely seize their assets during the investigation to ensure they cannot flee or hide the stolen capital they used to poach your instructors. Once I walk out of this room with your evidence, there is absolutely no turning back. Are you prepared to let them face the total destruction of their lives? I pulled my hand away from Liam's grasp and stood up from the heavy leather chair. I walked over to the massive digital map displaying the global deployment zones of my active training teams. I thought about the thousands of hours I had spent freezing in the snow, bleeding on jagged rocks, and studying advanced tactical medicine until my eyes burned. I thought about the men and women who relied on my curriculum to survive in the most hostile environments on Earth. I had built an empire of genuine life-saving substance, while my family built an empire of superficial status and toxic lies. They had mocked my passion, discarded me as a failure, and then plotted to steal my success the moment they realized its true value. They did not just try to steal my business, they tried to steal my entire identity. I turned back to face Liam, my spine perfectly straight and my resolve hardening into solid, unbreakable steel. I am not destroying my family. Liam, I stated, my voice echoing clearly in the quiet command center. They destroyed themselves the moment my father used that spare key to break into my home. They made their choices with absolute ruthless intent. They believed they were untouchable because they had money and social power. They believed I was too weak and too isolated to fight back. I walked back to the desk and picked up the encrypted flash drive containing the high-definition security footage of my parents committing the felony burglary. I placed the drive directly into Liam's outstretched hand. "I am completely ready, Liam," I said, looking directly into his dark, intense eyes. "Let the federal government do its job. Let Courtney try to explain her brilliant business strategy to a judge. I want them to face every single consequence of their own arrogant actions. I will not shield them from the fire they started themselves." Liam closed his hand around the flash drive, a slow, fierce smile spreading across his handsome face. He stood up, his imposing military presence filling the room. He slipped the drive securely into the inner pocket of his dress uniform. "That is exactly what I needed to hear," he said. "The Inspector General is waiting for my report. We are going to execute this perfectly." He stepped closer, closing the distance between us, and wrapped his arms around my waist, pulling me firmly against his chest. I felt the cool metal of his metals pressing against my sweater. "You are the strongest woman I have ever known, Haley," he murmured, kissing the top of my head. "They never stood a chance against you." I leaned into his embrace, drawing comfort from his unwavering, steady strength. We stood there in the quiet hum of the server room, two survivors preparing for the final devastating battle. The trap was fully armed, the evidence was secure, and the federal authorities were waiting in the shadows. My family thought they had successfully buried me alive. They were about to discover that they had actually just handed me the shovel. The door of the private elevator slid shut, sealing Liam safely away as he headed back to Washington with the encrypted drive. The moment he was gone, I did not go to sleep. I poured myself another cup of black coffee and sat back down at my command center workstation. The emotional weight of the evening had passed, entirely replaced by the cold, mechanical precision required to execute a flawless legal strike. I pulled up my secure communication channel and sent a brief message to my corporate attorney, Diane. I told her the federal authorities were officially in motion, and it was time for us to construct the civil lawsuit. Diane replied within 3 minutes, stating she would be at my gates by dawn. She instructed me to have every single piece of documentation ready for her review. When the sun began to peek over the jagged peaks of the Rocky Mountains, the perimeter alarm chimed softly. I watched the security feed as Diane pulled her sleek silver sedan through the heavy steel gates. Diane was a woman who commanded absolute authority. She stepped out of her car wearing an immaculate tailored suit, holding a thick leather briefcase that looked like it weighed 20 pounds. I met her at the elevator and brought her up to the command center. She did not waste time with pleasantries or small talk. She walked directly to the conference table in the center of the room and opened her briefcase. "We have a massive amount of work to do, Haley," she stated, her eyes scanning the glowing server racks. "The federal government will handle the criminal charges, but we are going to dismantle them in civil court. I want to bankrupt them so thoroughly they will never recover." We spent the next 6 hours meticulously building the legal guillotine. The first step was establishing an unbreakable chain of custody for the physical theft. I pulled up the time-stamped security footage, displaying it on the large primary monitor. We watched my parents break into the study over and over again. Diane took detailed notes, logging the exact time they entered, the precise moment my mother placed the black binders into her canvas bag, and the second my father shoved the hard drives into his jacket pocket. Diane demanded I print high-resolution still frames of their faces, clearly illuminated by the security cameras. We attached these images to the formal evidence log. There was absolutely no room for them to claim they were just borrowing materials. The footage proved malicious intent and coordinated burglary. The next phase of our preparation involved proving ownership. Courtney could try to claim that the survival concepts were public knowledge, but she had no idea how fiercely I protected my intellectual property. I accessed the secure digital vault where I stored all my corporate legal documents. I printed out the official federal copyright registrations for every single training manual, medical protocol, and risk assessment algorithm. These documents were stamped with federal seals dating back 5 years. They proved unequivocally that Apex Survival Solutions was the sole legal owner of the curriculum. Courtney had submitted a bid for a company that was legally registered less than a month ago. The contrast between my 5 years of established copyrighted history and her sudden magical production of identical materials would be instantly fatal to any defense her lawyers tried to mount. Diane arranged the copyright certificates in a neat stack on the conference table, her lips curling into a sharp, predatory smile. "This is magnificent, Haley," she said, tapping the documents with her pen. "Your sister basically handed us a signed confession when she submitted these copyrighted materials to the Department of Defense. But now we need to establish the monetary value of what they stole. In civil court, damages are calculated based on the financial worth of the intellectual property. We need to prove exactly how much your company is worth to demonstrate the sheer scale of their corporate espionage." I nodded and accessed my encrypted financial servers. I pulled up the comprehensive valuation reports generated by my independent auditors just 3 months prior. I printed the balance sheets, the active government contract ledgers, and the projected revenue forecasts for the next 5 years. I laid the financial summaries on the table in front of Diane. She adjusted her glasses and read through the numbers, her eyes widening slightly as she processed the bottom line. Apex Survival Solutions was officially valued at $50 million. The training manuals my parents stole were not just camping brochures. They were the foundational operational documents of a $50 million corporate enterprise. By stealing them to launch a competing business, my parents had committed grand larceny and corporate espionage on a massive financial scale. "This valuation changes everything," Diane explained, her voice vibrating with intense focus. "We are not just suing them for theft. We are suing them for intentional interference with prospective economic advantage and corporate espionage. The damages we can claim will be astronomical. I am drafting a devastating civil lawsuit that will target every single asset they possess. They thought they could bully a struggling daughter. Instead, they are going to face the full legal wrath of a $50 million corporation." We moved on to the next phase of the counterstrike. Diane began drafting the official cease and desist orders. These were not polite requests. They were aggressive, legally binding demands ordering Courtney and Summit Defense to immediately halt any and all use of my copyrighted materials. But we were not going to send these orders quietly through the mail. Diane planned to have them served publicly to maximize the psychological impact and establish a clear, undeniable record of notification. We wanted Courtney to know that we were watching her every move and that her manufactured corporate facade was crumbling around her. The most crucial part of our strategy, however, involved my father. Richard believed he was untouchable because of his own successful business and his expensive corporate lawyers. He thought he could use his wealth to protect Courtney and crush me in court. But Diane had found a massive fatal flaw in his arrogance. We reviewed the reports from my lead instructor, Caleb, who had accepted the fraudulent job offer from Courtney. Caleb had provided me with the routing numbers from the wire transfers Courtney used to pay the exorbitant non-refundable signing bonuses. Diane ran a rapid trace on those routing numbers, leveraging her extensive financial contacts. What she found made her laugh out loud. Richard had not used a personal checking account to fund his daughter's illegal poaching campaign. In his arrogance and haste, he had wired the money directly from his own corporate business accounts. He had used his company funds to finance the theft of my instructors and the launch of a fraudulent competitor. By doing so, he had legally intertwined his own business assets directly to the felony. "Do you realize what your father has done?" Haley Diane asked, looking up from her laptop with a look of absolute triumph. He used his corporate accounts to facilitate corporate espionage against a competitor. He tied his business directly to the theft. When I file this civil lawsuit, I am not just naming your parents as individuals. I am naming your father's entire company as an active co-conspirator in the espionage. I will file an injunction to freeze his corporate assets pending the outcome of the trial. We are going to bankrupt his business. He will not be able to pay his employees, let alone afford the expensive lawyers he threatened you with. He handed us the rope to hang him. I stared at the financial routing documents, feeling a cold, profound sense of finality. My father had built his entire identity around his business. He valued his corporate status above his own children, and now that very same business was going to be completely dismantled because he chose to steal from me. He had weaponized his wealth against me, and now that weapon was turning back to destroy him. It was the ultimate poetic justice. I nodded to Diane, giving her the absolute authorization to proceed with maximum hostility. Draft it all, I instructed, my voice steady and resolute. I want the civil suit ready to file the exact second the federal agents make their move. I want his accounts frozen. I want the cease and desist orders ready for delivery. They wanted to play a ruthless corporate game, and I am going to show them exactly how it is played. For the rest of the day, we finalized the paperwork. We printed hundreds of pages of evidence, binding them into thick, unassailable legal dossiers. We created duplicate backups, storing them on encrypted drives. Diane drafted the lawsuits with surgical precision, leaving absolutely no loopholes for their attorneys to exploit. The legal guillotine was now fully constructed, its blade sharpened and raised high. My family was happily planning their victory celebrations, completely unaware that I held the power to eradicate their entire legacy with a single signature. I watched Diane pack the finished dossiers into her heavy leather briefcase. The trap was perfect. All we needed now was for Courtney to throw her extravagant party and invite us all to watch her fall. 3 days passed in absolute, calculated silence. I monitored the digital tripwires Diane and I constructed. My family continued their aggressive smear campaign, completely unaware that every single toxic message was being archived for the impending civil lawsuit. The perimeter alarm chimed. I accessed the front gate security camera and saw a man in a crisp uniform holding a black box. He was an elite private courier. I instructed him to leave the package in the lockbox at the gate. I drove down the winding driveway to retrieve the delivery. The box was wrapped in thick black velvet ribbon and sealed with a heavy wax stamp bearing the newly manufactured Summit Defense logo. Courtney had spared no expense for her theatrics. I carried the box into my kitchen and sliced the ribbon. Inside, nestled on black silk, was a heavy cardstock envelope. I pulled it out and slid my thumb under the flap. The invitation inside was a masterclass in profound, unearned arrogance. It was printed on thick, textured paper with glittering gold foil lettering. It formally invited me to the Summit Defense Victory Gala to be held that very Saturday evening at the grand ballroom of the most expensive downtown hotel. I stared at the shimmering gold letters, feeling a genuine burst of incredulous laughter bubble up in my chest. Courtney was hosting a massive victory gala to celebrate winning a multi-million-dollar Department of Defense contract. But I knew exactly how the federal procurement system operated. The bidding window had closed only 48 hours ago. The military evaluators would take at least 3 weeks to thoroughly review the submissions and conduct mandatory background checks. The Department of Defense had not awarded Courtney the contract. They had simply sent her an automated system-generated email confirming that her digital file had been successfully received and placed under review. My sister had mistaken a basic digital receipt for a binding federal contract. Her staggering hubris had blinded her to basic corporate reality. She had immediately booked a luxury ballroom, ordered expensive catering, and invited Denver high society to celebrate a massive victory she had not actually won. As I placed the ridiculous gold foil invitation on my kitchen island, I noticed a smaller white envelope tucked into the bottom of the black velvet box. I recognized the neat looping handwriting immediately. It was from my mother. I opened the envelope and pulled out a single sheet of heavy stationery. Susan had written a short personal note intended to deliver a psychological death blow. I read the words slowly, letting their sheer, toxic arrogance wash over me. Come see what true success looks like. Haley, my mother, had written, her pen strokes sharp and aggressive. It is time you finally accepted your place in this family. If you show up tonight, look presentable and behave yourself, I will speak to your sister on your behalf. Maybe Courtney will offer you an entry-level job at Summit Defense if you offer her a sincere public apology. Do not ruin this opportunity. It is the only lifeline you have left. I set the handwritten note down next to the gold invitation. The sheer magnitude of their delusion was almost breathtaking. My mother genuinely believed she had completely broken me. She thought her smear campaign meant I was cowering in my cabin, defeated and desperate. She was graciously offering me a humiliating entry-level position at a fraudulent company built entirely on my own stolen intellectual property. They wanted me to attend specifically so they could parade me around as the conquered failure. They wanted to force me to publicly bow down to Courtney in front of their wealthy friends, cementing her status as the superior golden child once and for all. I looked at the gold foil lettering and the arrogant handwritten note, and I made a definitive choice. I was not going to hide in the mountains while they celebrated their crimes. I was going to accept their invitation. I was going to walk directly into the center of their opulent victory party, and I was going to be the absolute architect of their destruction. But if I was going to attend a high society gala, I could not show up in my standard tactical boots and canvas jackets. I needed to look the part of a multi-million-dollar chief executive officer. I needed to dress for a corporate execution. I drove down the mountain, heading straight for the most exclusive high-end fashion district in downtown Denver. I parked the sleek European vehicle and walked into a luxury designer boutique that I knew my mother and sister frequently patronized. The sales associates hesitated at my plain clothing, but their demeanor shifted into aggressive subservience the moment I handed them my solid black metal corporate card. I told the lead stylist exactly what I needed. I did not want something soft or delicate. I wanted something that radiated absolute lethal authority. I spent 2 hours in the private fitting room. When I finally found the perfect gown, it felt like putting on a suit of impenetrable armor. It was a floor-length masterpiece of midnight blue silk. The fabric gathered elegantly at the waist and flowed to the floor with a dangerous, fluid grace. The neckline was sharp and architectural, conveying a severe corporate professionalism, while the deep blue color perfectly matched the cold, analytical focus in my eyes. It relied purely on flawless design and immaculate tailoring to command attention. I paired the gown with classic diamond stud earrings and sleek, dangerously high black heels. I scheduled a professional hair and makeup team to meet me at my estate later that afternoon. They transformed my windblown mountain aesthetic into a razor-sharp, polished corporate look. My hair was styled into a sleek, flawless blowout that fell perfectly down my back. The makeup artist gave me a bold, structured look with sharp contouring and a deep red lip that finalized the transformation. When I looked in the mirror, I did not recognize the rugged wilderness instructor from 6 months ago. I did not see the rejected scapegoat daughter who used to shrink under her parents' cruel remarks. The woman staring back at me was the formidable, incredibly wealthy founder of Apex Survival Solutions. I looked like a woman who could dismantle a fraudulent corporation before the appetizers were even served. I looked like a boss. I walked out of my bedroom and took the elevator up to the command center one last time. The gala was scheduled to begin in exactly 1 hour. I picked up my encrypted satellite phone, holding it carefully so I would not smudge my immaculate manicure. I opened my secure messaging channel to Liam. He had flown back into Denver early this morning to coordinate the final operational logistics with the federal authorities. I typed a brief, precise message. I am dressed and deploying to the target location. Are the federal agents in position and ready to execute? I watched the screen, waiting for the confirmation. Less than 30 seconds later, my phone vibrated in my palm. Liam's response appeared on the encrypted interface. The perimeter is fully secured. The federal investigators are briefed and waiting in the staging area. I am putting on my dress blues now. See you at the gala, CEO. I smiled, locking the phone and dropping it into my structured clutch purse. The board was perfectly set. Courtney had gathered all the most important, influential people in our extended family and the Denver business community into one single opulent room. She had built a massive stage for herself and commanded everyone to watch her shine. She had provided the exact public audience I needed to ensure her downfall was absolutely legendary. I turned off the main monitors in the command center, leaving only the essential security systems running. I took the elevator down to the garage and bypassed my heavy off-road truck, walking instead toward the sleek European sports car. The engine purred to life with a low, powerful growl. I drove out of the estate, the heavy steel gates closing securely behind me. The drive down the mountain felt fast, my adrenaline sharpening my senses. I navigated the winding roads with practiced precision, heading straight toward the glowing skyline of downtown Denver. My family thought they had broken my spirit and stolen my future. They thought they were about to be crowned royalty of the defense contracting world. They had absolutely no idea that the federal guillotine was already loaded and I was driving down the mountain to personally pull the lever. I pulled the sleek European sports car up to the valet stand of the grand downtown hotel. The valet, accustomed to luxury vehicles, eagerly opened my door. I stepped out onto the red carpet, handing him the keys with a crisp, professional nod. The freezing night air barely registered against my bare shoulders as I walked through the towering glass doors and into the opulent hotel lobby. Crystal chandeliers cast a dazzling, brilliant light across the polished marble floors. A massive digital display board directed guests to the grand ballroom for the Summit Defense Victory Gala. I followed the velvet ropes and extravagant floral arrangements, my stiletto heels clicking rhythmically against the stone, sounding exactly like the steady, relentless tick of a countdown timer. As I approached the grand entrance of the ballroom, I took a moment to observe the sheer, staggering scale of the financial hubris on display. Two massive ice sculptures flanked the double doors, carved into the shape of jagged mountains, with the stolen Summit Defense logo etched deeply into the frost. A string quartet played lively classical music in the foyer. Waiters circulated continuously with silver trays of champagne and expensive caviar hors d'oeuvres. My father had clearly liquidated a massive amount of his corporate liquidity to fund this theatrical display of premature triumph. He wanted Denver high society to see his golden child crowned as a titan of the defense industry. I smoothed the pristine fabric of my midnight blue silk gown, felt the cool weight of my diamond earrings, and stepped confidently into the ballroom. The sheer visual impact of my entrance was immediate and absolute. I did not sneak in through the side doors or hover nervously near the coat check like an unwanted guest. I walked directly down the center aisle of the expansive ballroom, holding myself with the rigid, flawless posture of a military commander. For the first few seconds, only the people nearest the entrance noticed me. But as I continued my deliberate, unhurried walk toward the center of the room, a ripple of stunned recognition began to spread rapidly through the dense crowd. Conversations abruptly halted mid-sentence. The clinking of crystal glasses faded away into a heavy, oppressive silence. Heads turned, eyes widened, and the ambient noise of the gala dropped to an uncomfortable, echoing murmur. These were people who had been fed a steady, toxic diet of vicious lies for the past week. They had been told repeatedly by my parents that I was suffering a severe mental breakdown. They had been assured that I was a bitter, unhinged outcast living in squalor, completely consumed by petty jealousy over my sister's success. They were entirely prepared for a deranged woman in muddy hiking boots to burst through the doors and throw a hysterical, tearful tantrum. They were fully expecting a public spectacle of pathetic desperation. Instead, they were staring at a woman who radiated absolute, lethal corporate authority. The midnight blue designer gown moved with fluid grace around my athletic frame. My sleek, polished hair and sharp, immaculate makeup masked any trace of the rugged wilderness instructor they thought they knew. I looked richer, sharper, and far more powerful than anyone else in the room. I saw my Aunt Cheryl, who had texted me the most vicious insults just days ago, freeze with a champagne flute halfway to her lips, her mouth hanging open in sheer disbelief. My cousin David, who had called me a bitter failure, stared at me as if I were a literal ghost. Across the sprawling ballroom, I locked eyes with my immediate family. Courtney was standing near the main stage, wearing a flashy gold sequined dress that looked cheap and desperate for attention compared to my understated elegance. The exact moment she saw me, The smug, victorious smile completely vanished from her face, replaced by a look of sheer, unadulterated panic. My mother, Susan, actually dropped her clutch purse onto the floor. She had demanded I show up to beg for an entry-level job, expecting me to arrive broken and submissive. Seeing me look like a billionaire chief executive officer completely short-circuited her brain. My father Richard was the first to snap out of his frozen state. His face flushed a dark, angry purple. He immediately recognized that my presence, looking the exact way I did, completely shattered the false narrative he had spent a week carefully constructing. He set his drink down heavily on a passing waiter's tray and marched directly toward me, his heavy footsteps eating up the distance between us. He moved with aggressive, intimidating purpose, clearly intending to intercept me before I could speak to any of the important high society guests or military contacts he had invited. "Haley," he hissed, his voice a low, furious whisper as he closed the final few feet between us. "What on earth are you wearing? What are you doing here looking like this?" I stopped walking and looked at him calmly, maintaining my perfect posture. "I am attending the Victory Gala, Dad," I replied, my voice perfectly level and devoid of any intimidation. "Mom sent me a very specific invitation. She even included a lovely handwritten note suggesting I come see what true success looks like." I decided to take her up on the generous offer to join the celebration today. Richard lunged forward, reaching out with his large hand to aggressively grab my upper arm. He intended to physically steer me toward the dark service corridor at the back of the ballroom, desperate to push me out of the spotlight before I could ruin his carefully curated performance. "Keep your voice down," he ordered, his fingers curling like a vice. "You are going to walk to the back room right now. You are going to stay completely out of sight, and you are not going to embarrass this family tonight. Do you understand me?" My father was a large, imposing man who was entirely used to physically and financially bullying people into total submission. But I had spent the last decade executing tactical survival maneuvers, lifting heavy equipment up frozen mountains, and training alongside elite military reconnaissance units. His clumsy attempt to physically control me was almost laughable to me now. As his hand clamped down on my bare arm, I did not flinch. I did not pull away wildly or cause a frantic scene. Instead, using a very precise, calculated shift in my center of gravity, I fluidly rotated my shoulder and applied a sharp counter-leverage maneuver against his wrist. It was a subtle, almost invisible tactical release, but it instantly broke his grip with a sharp jolt of pain that made him gasp and stumble a half-step backward in absolute shock. I smoothed the silk fabric of my sleeve where his hand had been, my expression remaining completely serene. "Do not ever attempt to put your hands on me again, Richard," I stated, dropping the title of father entirely. "I am not a frightened child you can drag into the shadows. I am an invited guest at this gala, and I am going to enjoy the evening exactly as I see fit." Richard stood there, rubbing his wrist, looking absolutely bewildered by the physical interaction. He looked around nervously, realizing that dozens of influential guests were watching our exchange with intense curiosity. He could not yell at me. He could not force me to leave without causing the exact massive public scene he was desperately trying to avoid. He was completely trapped by his own obsessive desire to maintain appearances at all costs. I turned away from his stunned face and continued my slow, deliberate walk into the heart of the ballroom. The tension in the air was thick, suffocating, and incredibly electric. Every single member of my extended family was tracking my movements. They clustered together in small, anxious groups, whispering furiously behind their hands. They were waiting for the other shoe to drop. They were waiting for me to launch into the bitter, jealous tirade my parents had promised them. They watched my hands looking for a trembling glass. They watched my face looking for the frantic, unhinged desperation of a woman having a mental breakdown. I gave them absolutely nothing. I moved through the opulent room with the quiet, lethal confidence of an apex predator circling its prey. I approached a passing waiter, offering a polite, radiant smile, and smoothly lifted a crystal flute of champagne from his silver tray. I took a slow, elegant sip, letting my eyes sweep across the extravagant decorations. The giant banners displaying the Summit Defense logo hung from the ceiling, mocking the very concept of integrity. The irony of my parents spending hundreds of thousands of dollars to celebrate a federal felony was a beautiful poetic tragedy that only I fully understood. I positioned myself near the front of the room, intentionally claiming space directly in the sightline of the main stage. I wanted Courtney to see me clearly when she stepped up to the podium. I wanted her to look out into the audience and realize that the sister she had bullied, stolen from, and tried to destroy was standing right in the front row looking like absolute royalty. My Aunt Cheryl nervously edged closer to me, her eyes darting between my designer gown and my calm expression. "Haley," she stammered, her voice lacking the venom of her recent text messages. "We did not expect you to look so composed today. Your mother said you were struggling terribly." I turned to face her, letting the cold, analytical focus of my gaze pin her in place. "My mother says a lot of things, Cheryl," I replied, my voice carrying just enough volume to ensure the surrounding relatives could hear me clearly. "But as you will all discover very shortly, Susan has a profound talent for manufacturing pure fiction. I am perfectly fine. In fact, I have never been better. I turned my attention back to the main stage, sipping my champagne. The room vibrated with unresolved tension, a collective holding of breath. They thought they were attending a joyous coronation. They had absolutely no idea they were actually gathered for a massive public execution, and I was the one holding the blade. I watched the overhead lights reflect off the expensive crystal glassware. I took another slow, calculated breath and waited patiently for the lively classical music to stop playing. The final performance of their fraudulent empire was about to begin, and I was fully prepared to watch them fall. The trap was now locked in place completely. The lively classical music floating through the grand ballroom slowly faded away, replaced by the sharp feedback of a microphone being tapped. The overhead crystal chandeliers dimmed slightly as a bright spotlight illuminated the main stage. A hush fell over the opulent room. The hundreds of wealthy guests, investors, and extended family members turned their attention forward. Courtney stepped up to the acrylic podium, her gold sequined dress catching the harsh light. She adjusted the microphone with a practiced, overly dramatic sigh of manufactured humility. She looked out over the sea of faces, her chest puffed out with unearned pride. I stood my ground in the front row, perfectly still, my midnight blue silk gown absorbing the light. "Thank you all for being here tonight," Courtney began, her voice echoing through the massive ballroom. "When I first conceptualized Summit Defense, I knew I was embarking on a journey that would challenge me to my absolute core. The defense contracting industry is ruthless. It demands perfection, innovation, and an unwavering commitment to excellence. But I looked at the outdated survival training protocols currently used by our military, and I knew I had the vision to revolutionize them. I spent countless sleepless nights designing a comprehensive medical and tactical curriculum from scratch. I poured my sweat and my tears into building a program that will save the lives of our nation's elite warfighters." I took a slow, deliberate sip of my champagne, listening to her claim my years of literal blood sweat and freezing nights in the wilderness as her own desk work was a masterclass in sociopathic delusion. She spoke with such profound conviction that the wealthy guests around me were nodding in deep respect. They were completely captivated by her performance. "But success does not come without a price." Courtney continued, her tone shifting from triumphant to falsely solemn. "When you strive for greatness, you inevitably encounter people who want to drag you back down to their level. You encounter toxic negativity from those who lack the drive to build something real." She paused, letting the silence stretch for theatrical effect. Then she turned her head and locked her eyes directly onto mine. The guest standing near me naturally followed her gaze, stepping slightly away from me, as if my supposed failure was a contagious disease. "We have to be willing to cut out the dead weight," Courtney declared, her voice ringing with vicious authority while she stared right at me. "We have to overcome the bitter jealousy of people who want to see us fail simply because they are too lazy to succeed on their own merits. I stand before you tonight as proof that when you refuse to let toxic people hold you back, the universe rewards you. I did not let the negativity break me. I used it as fuel to build this empire. The ballroom erupted into thunderous applause. My mother, Susan, was clapping so hard her diamond bracelets rattled loudly against each other. My extended family members beamed with pride, throwing me disgusted, arrogant glares. They thought Courtney had just delivered a brilliant, devastating public humiliation. They thought she had elegantly put me in my place. I simply smiled, holding her gaze without blinking, and raised my crystal champagne flute in a silent, mocking toast. Her eyes flashed with sudden uncertainty, rattled by my complete lack of a reaction, but she quickly turned back to her adoring audience. Richard proudly strode onto the stage, stepping up to the podium and wrapping a heavy arm around Courtney's shoulders. He beamed at the crowd, his face flushed with the ultimate validation of his parenting. "Ladies and gentlemen," my daughter Richard announced, his voice booming with absolute triumph. "A brilliant mind, an unstoppable entrepreneur, and the future of the defense industry." When she submitted her proposal to the Department of Defense, they recognized her genius immediately. The federal government does not hand out multi-million-dollar contracts to just anyone. They demand the absolute best, and that is exactly what Summit Defense delivers. He paused, puffing out his chest and adjusting his expensive silk tie. "Tonight is not just a celebration of a successful bid. We are incredibly honored to have a very special guest with us." The Department of Defense was so profoundly impressed by Courtney's tactical curriculum that they sent a high-ranking military liaison to join us this evening. He flew in directly from the Pentagon to officially present the contract and formally welcome Summit Defense into the federal contracting family. Richard gestured grandly toward the back of the ballroom, his voice reaching a fever pitch. "Please direct your attention to the main doors and join me in welcoming Major Liam Caldwell of the United States Marine Corps." The audience turned collectively toward the entrance, polite applause rippling through the crowd. The heavy mahogany double doors at the back of the ballroom swung open with a forceful synchronized push. The ambient chatter in the room instantly evaporated. Major Liam Caldwell stepped over the threshold, and the sheer imposing weight of his presence instantly dominated the massive space. He was in his full Marine Corps dress blues, the dark fabric immaculate and pristine. The gold buttons gleamed, and the colorful rows of commendations on his chest spoke of real brutal combat experience. He looked incredibly dangerous, powerful, and utterly devoid of the superficial warmth these high society people were used to. He was not alone. Flanking him on either side were two men wearing sharp dark suits with earpieces trailing down their necks. They moved with the synchronized, predatory coordination of federal agents. They did not look at the ice sculptures or the expensive floral arrangements. Their eyes continuously scanned the crowd, assessing threats and locking down the exits. The polite applause died out completely, replaced by a heavy, thick wave of confusion and nervous tension. This did not look like a friendly corporate greeting. This looked like a tactical military operation. The crowd parted instinctively, scrambling to get out of their way. Liam walked straight down the center aisle, his polished black shoes striking the marble floor with loud, measured precision. He looked neither left nor right, his dark eyes locked dead ahead. From my position in the front row, I watched the beautiful lethal geometry of the trap snapping shut. On the stage, Courtney was practically vibrating with desperate excitement. She completely misread the severity of the situation, assuming the military escort was simply a grand display of respect for her brilliant business acumen. She smoothed her gold-sequined dress, pasted on her most dazzling, flirtatious smile, and practically bounded off the stage. She rushed down the center aisle, her high heels clicking rapidly, determined to intercept Liam before he reached the front of the room. She wanted the photo opportunity. She wanted everyone to see the decorated military officer bowing to her corporate genius. "Major Caldwell." She called out, her voice dripping with artificial sweetness as she closed the distance between them. "I am so incredibly thrilled you could make it to my celebration. We are just so honored to have you." She reached out with both hands, preparing to grasp his arm and pull him into a highly visible public embrace. Liam did not slow down. He did not extend his hand. He did not even break his stride. With a cold, fluid motion, he smoothly sidestepped her advancing form completely, ignoring her outstretched hands. The movement was so precise and dismissive that Courtney stumbled forward, grasping at empty air. Her enthusiastic greeting died in her throat, her face freezing in a mask of total mortification. A collective gasp rippled through the nearby guests. Liam walked straight past her, leaving her standing awkwardly in the middle of the aisle. He approached the stage where my father was waiting with an outstretched hand and a wide, welcoming smile. Richard opened his mouth to offer a booming greeting, but Liam stepped right past him without a single glance. He moved with undeniable authority, stepping directly up to the acrylic podium. The two federal agents took positions at the base of the stairs, their arms crossed, their faces carved from stone. Liam gripped the edges of the podium, leaning into the microphone. He looked out over the sea of wealthy, confused faces. His dark, intense eyes swept the room before finding me in the front row. For a fraction of a second, the rigid military mask slipped, and I saw the fierce, protective loyalty burning in his gaze. Then he turned his attention back to the silent, terrified crowd. The ballroom was so quiet I could hear the hum of the air conditioning vents overhead. No one dared to move. My mother had stopped breathing. Richard stood frozen behind Liam, his outstretched hand slowly dropping to his side. Courtney was still standing in the center aisle, her gold dress suddenly looking incredibly foolish under the harsh stage lights. The manufactured reality my family had spent their entire lives building was holding its breath, waiting for the final devastating blow. The executioner had arrived, and the silence in the room was absolute. Major Liam Caldwell adjusted the microphone, his dark eyes scanning the completely silent ballroom before settling on the center of the crowd. The Department of Defense does not award critical tactical contracts based on superficial corporate networking or amateur proposals. He began, his voice carrying absolute, unquestionable authority. We require battle-tested protocols, proven methodologies, and instructors who have demonstrated unparalleled expertise in the most hostile environments on Earth. When we review submissions, we look for the true, undisputed industry leader in wilderness medicine and survival tactics. We look for a company that has already built a legacy of saving lives in the field. He paused, letting the weight of his words sink into the bewildered high society audience. Therefore, he continued, his tone rising with formal military cadence. I am incredibly honored to be here tonight to officially present this multi-million-dollar federal contract, not to the newly registered entity known as Summit Defense, but to the actual undisputed industry leader. He extended his hand, gesturing directly toward me in the front row. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming the true architect of this curriculum, the founder and chief executive officer of Apex Survival Solutions. The silence shattered completely. A massive collective gasp echoed through the opulent ballroom. I stood up from my velvet chair, the midnight blue silk of my gown catching the spotlight as I stepped out into the center aisle. I did not look at my parents, who were standing frozen in sheer, unadulterated horror. I did not look at Courtney, whose mouth was hanging open in an ugly mask of disbelief. I walked slowly up the center aisle, my high heels clicking rhythmically against the polished floor, ascending the stairs to the main stage with perfect calm grace. Liam stepped back from the podium, yielding the floor to me with a crisp, respectful nod. I gripped the edges of the acrylic podium, looking out over the sea of incredibly wealthy, incredibly confused faces. I let the silence stretch for a long, terrifying moment, letting my family squirm under the intense pressure of the spotlight. Good evening, everyone. I said, my voice steady, clear, and completely devoid of the nervous stammering they always expected from me. Thank you for gathering here tonight. As Major Caldwell just confirmed, my company Apex Survival Solutions has officially secured the federal contract. My sister Courtney was absolutely correct about one thing earlier tonight. The defense contracting industry is incredibly ruthless, and you must be willing to cut out the dead weight. I turned my head slightly, looking directly at my sister, who was shaking uncontrollably in her cheap gold sequined dress. The problem, Courtney, I stated sharply, is that you fundamentally misunderstood who the dead weight actually was. You see, Summit Defense does not exist. It has no proprietary curriculum, no trained personnel, and no history of operational success. Summit Defense is nothing more than a flimsy, fraudulent shell company built entirely on stolen intellectual property. My intellectual property. My father. Richard suddenly jolted back to life, his face flushing dark purple with rage and panic. He lunged forward toward the stage, his hands raised defensively. Haley, he shouted, his voice cracking with desperation. That is enough. This is a private family matter. We are partners in this venture. Do not do this. Do not embarrass us tonight. I looked down at the man who had threatened to bankrupt me just 3 days ago. We are not partners, Richard, I replied coldly, using his first name to sever any remaining illusion of familial connection. And this is not a private family matter. This is a matter of federal law. I pulled a small remote clicker from my clutch purse and aimed it at the massive audiovisual booth at the back of the ballroom. A moment ago, these giant projector screens were scheduled to display the Summit Defense logo. Let us show everyone how this company was actually built instead. I pressed the button. The massive high-definition screens flanking the stage instantly switched from the generic blue holding graphic to the crisp night vision feed from my home security cameras. The giant screens clearly displayed the timestamp 7:15 p.m. directly over the footage. The entire ballroom watched in absolute horrified fascination as my parents' luxury vehicle pulled up to my mountain estate. They watched my father use the stolen spare key. They watched my mother Susan physically shove my proprietary black training binders into her canvas bag. They watched my father rifle through my oak desk and pocket my external hard drives. The crystal-clear audio echoed through the grand ballroom, playing my mother's exact words for everyone to hear. Look for the black binders. Courtney said the medical protocols are in the black binders. The reaction from the audience was instantaneous and devastating. The wealthy investors, the high society socialites, and the influential country club members, who had praised my parents just moments ago, were now staring at them with profound visible disgust. The pristine, respectable image my parents had spent 30 years cultivating was obliterated in less than 60 seconds. They were not titans of industry. They were common thieves caught on high-definition camera, robbing their own daughter. Susan covered her face with her hands, letting out a loud, ragged sob. Richard stumbled backward, physically shrinking away from the massive screens, projecting his crime to his entire social circle. I turned off the video feed, plunging the screens into blackness. I turned my attention back to my sister, who was now hyperventilating near the front row, tears streaming through her heavy makeup. You thought you could just take my life work, Courtney, I said, my voice dropping to a lethal, focused whisper. You thought you could strip my name off my tactical medical protocols and submit them to the federal government as your own. You thought your business degree made you smarter than the woman who spent a decade building an empire in the dirt. But you failed to understand the basic mechanics of federal procurement. The two men in sharp, dark suits who had flanked Liam suddenly stepped forward, moving with terrifying, synchronized precision. They bypassed Richard and Susan, entirely heading straight for Courtney. The crowd parted rapidly, giving the federal agents a wide berth. The lead agent reached into his jacket and pulled out a leather wallet, flipping it open to display a polished federal badge. Courtney Anderson, the agent, stated, his voice loud enough to carry over the frightened murmurs of the crowd. We are investigators with the Office of the Inspector General for the Department of Defense. Courtney let out a sharp, hysterical gasp, backing away until she bumped hard against a catering table, sending a tower of champagne glasses crashing to the marble floor in a shower of shattered crystal. No, she cried out, holding her hands up defensively. It was just a misunderstanding. My parents told me they had permission to borrow the files. I did not know they were stolen. I swear I did not know. The second agent stepped closer, pulling a pair of heavy steel handcuffs from his belt. Ignorance of the theft does not negate the perjury you committed when you digitally signed the federal bidding documents, the agent replied coldly. You submitted highly classified proprietary materials across state lines through a secure military portal, claiming them as your original work. You attempted to defraud the United States government on a multi-million-dollar defense contract. That constitutes felony contracting fraud, wire fraud, and perjury. You are under arrest. The sound of the steel handcuffs ratcheting tightly around Courtney's wrists echoed sharply through the silent ballroom. My sister, the golden child who had spent her entire life being praised for her manufactured perfection, was now sobbing hysterically as federal agents secured her hands behind her back. She looked wildly at our parents, begging them to save her, begging them to use their wealth to fix the problem they had all created together. But Richard and Susan were completely paralyzed, trapped in the terrifying realization that their money and social influence were absolutely useless against the full crushing weight of the federal justice system. The elaborate fraudulent empire they had tried to build had collapsed directly on top of them, burying them completely. The trap I had so carefully constructed had closed flawlessly, and the execution was absolute. My father scrambled forward his expensive custom-tailored suit, looking suddenly disheveled as the absolute gravity of the situation finally breached his thick skull. The sight of federal agents physically restraining his golden child shattered the last remaining fragments of his arrogant composure. He pushed past the frozen catering staff, waving his hands frantically in a desperate attempt to halt the catastrophic public execution of his family. "Wait, there has been a massive misunderstanding," Richard shouted, his voice cracking as he addressed the federal investigators. "We are partner companies. Summit Defense and Apex Survival Solutions are an integrated family enterprise. We were simply sharing corporate resources. My daughter Courtney had full authorization to submit those documents on behalf of our joint venture. This is a civil administrative error, not a criminal offense." The sheer desperation of his lie was almost painful to witness. He was trying to rewrite reality in real time, hoping he could somehow bully federal agents the way he bullied everyone else in his life. But I was not about to let him build another false narrative to protect himself. "I am afraid that is entirely incorrect, Richard." A sharp, authoritative voice echoed through the silent ballroom. "Diane." My brilliant corporate attorney stepped out from the shadows near the entrance of the ballroom. She moved with ruthless, lethal purpose, her high heels clicking sharply as she approached the stage. She bypassed the bewildered guests and walked directly up to my father, holding a thick, heavy stack of legal documents bound in severe red folders. "My name is Diane Vance," she announced, her voice ringing clearly across the opulent space. "I am the lead corporate counsel for Apex Survival Solutions. I can confirm unequivocally that there is absolutely no partnership, joint venture, or resource-sharing agreement of any kind between my client and the fraudulent entity known as Summit Defense." Diane stopped right in front of Richard, thrusting the massive stack of legal documents directly into his chest, forcing him to instinctively grab them. "Furthermore, Richard," she continued, her tone dropping into a cold, predatory cadence, "my firm just filed a massive civil lawsuit against you personally and against your primary holding corporation. We have irrefutable time-stamped evidence that you used your own corporate business accounts to illegally wire funds to poach independent contractors from my client." Richard stared down at the thick stack of lawsuits in his hands, his face draining of all remaining color. He looked like a man who had just realized he stepped on a landmine. "You used your company liquidity to actively finance corporate espionage against a competitor," Diane stated clearly, ensuring every wealthy investor in the room heard the accusation. "The presiding judge signed an emergency injunction less than an hour ago. All of your corporate accounts and personal assets are officially frozen pending the outcome of the trial. You are effectively bankrupt, Richard." My mother let out a shrill, devastated wail, collapsing into a velvet chair near the front row. The carefully constructed facade of Denver high society perfection they had spent 3 decades building had been completely, utterly eradicated in less than 5 minutes. They had invited their entire social circle to witness a coronation, and instead they were publicly broadcasting their own financial and criminal execution. The 2 federal agents tightened their grip on Courtney's arms, turning her toward the center aisle. She was sobbing uncontrollably, her heavy makeup running down her face in dark, messy streaks. She looked wildly at the crowd, begging her wealthy friends for help, pleading with our extended family to intervene. "Please," she screamed, her voice hoarse and desperate. "Mom, Dad, do something. Call your lawyers, make them stop." But Richard and Susan did absolutely nothing. They were completely paralyzed, entirely consumed by the realization that their own lives were collapsing into absolute ruin. They could not save Courtney, because they could not even save themselves. The federal agents escorted my hysterical sister down the long center aisle of the ballroom. The wealthy guests who had been cheering for her just minutes ago now recoiled physically, shrinking back to avoid making eye contact with a federal criminal. I watched her go, feeling a profound sense of closure. The toxic cycle that had defined my entire existence was officially, permanently broken. The family that had tried to crush my spirit, exploit my labor, and steal my identity had been completely dismantled by their own relentless arrogance. They had built a massive pyre of lies, and I had simply handed them the match. I turned away from the stage, ignoring my parents, who were now completely surrounded by the wreckage of their social reputation. I did not offer a parting insult. I did not demand an apology or gloat over their destruction. Their absolute total ruin was statement enough. I smoothed the midnight blue silk of my designer gown and began my slow, deliberate walk back down the center aisle, heading toward the grand exit. The crowd parted for me, immediately stepping back with a mixture of deep respect and genuine, terrifying awe. I pushed through the heavy mahogany double doors, leaving the suffocating, toxic atmosphere of the ballroom behind me. The cool air of the opulent hotel lobby felt crisp and clean. I took a deep, stabilizing breath, feeling the heavy, invisible weight I had carried since childhood finally lift completely off my shoulders. I was entirely free. I heard the heavy, steady cadence of polished military shoes striking the marble floor behind me. Major Liam Caldwell caught up to me as I reached the massive glass doors of the hotel entrance. He had shed the rigid, stoic military mask he wore inside the ballroom. The fierce, protective intensity in his dark eyes had softened into a warm, profound admiration. He fell into step right beside me, perfectly matching my pace. We walked out onto the grand portico, the freezing mountain air swirling around us. The valet immediately spotted me and rushed to retrieve my sleek European sports car. Liam looked down at me, a familiar, devastatingly handsome smirk playing at the corners of his mouth. He smoothly slipped his strong, warm hand into mine, lacing his fingers securely through my own. So he asked, his deep voice rumbling pleasantly in the quiet night air, "How does it feel to be the boss?" I stopped walking and looked back over my shoulder. Through the towering glass doors, I could see the distant chaos unfolding in the ballroom. The flashing lights of the local police cruisers were already pulling up to the curb to assist the federal agents with the arrest. I looked at the shattered remains of my toxic family, their manufactured empire reduced to absolute rubble. Then I looked up at the man standing beside me, the man who had carried me through a blizzard, who had fiercely guarded my secrets, and who had stood solidly by my side as I reclaimed my entire life. I smiled, a genuine, radiant expression that reached my eyes for the first time all evening. "Feels like exactly where I am supposed to be," I said. I squeezed his hand, turned toward my waiting car, and stepped confidently into the brilliant, completely unburdened future I had built with my own two hands. We are often conditioned to believe that family is everything, that shared blood demands our unwavering loyalty, no matter the cost. But my journey taught me a harsh, incredibly necessary truth. DNA is not a free pass for abuse, exploitation, or the constant erosion of your self-worth. When the people who are supposed to protect you become the very predators you need, protection from walking away isn't a failure, it is the ultimate act of self-preservation. For decades, my parents and sister tried to convince me I was nothing but a disappointment. They needed me to be small so their manufactured superficial success could appear larger. But true value isn't granted by toxic people at a country club dinner table. It is forged in the quiet, grueling hours of hard work you put in when absolutely no one is watching. I built an empire in the dirt, the ice and the snow, not by tearing others down, but by mastering my craft with relentless discipline. When my family finally recognized my worth, they didn't celebrate it, they tried to steal it. The most profound lesson I learned is that you must ruthlessly protect your peace, your boundaries, and your achievements. You don't have to scream to prove your point. Let your silent, undeniable success speak for itself, and let the crushing weight of natural consequences handle those who try to extinguish your light. The family you actually choose, the ones who will carry you through a freezing blizzard rather than push you off a mountain, is the only family that truly matters. Have you ever had to draw a hard line with toxic family members who completely underestimated your worth? How did you find the courage to stop seeking their approval and start building your own empire? Share your story in the comments below. If my journey to claiming my power resonated with you, please hit that like button and subscribe for more stories about surviving the harshest environments both in the wilderness and in life. Remember, your worth is yours alone to define.